Tonight we wish to study Likutei Halachos of Rabbi Nosson, Hilchos Chovel b'Chavero, Halacha Gimel, which is based on Likutei Maran Simon Samach Zayin. That's just by way of introduction. And as you know, Likutei Halachos is a study of the Pnimius HaTorah, in this case of Chovel b'Chavero. Chovel b'Chavero is somebody who injures someone else and he draws blood, but it's prohibited even to raise a hand and threaten a person by threatening to hit him. And if a person does wound his friend, he has to pay 5 categories of tashlumin, which are called nezek, tsar, ripuy, sheves, and boshes. This presentation of Rabbi Nosson tonight is an elaboration of the concept called kavod. And we translate kavod loosely into English as honor or glory. However, it loses a great deal in translation. And that's because the concept of kavod is a divine concept. In fact, David HaMelech dedicates an entire chapter to the kavod Hashem. And we say that the Mishkan is Kvod Hashem, so that the concept of kavod really belongs to the divine. And Rabbi Nachman establishes, based on the Torah of the Arizal, that the nefesh of a person, of every single Jew, has its source in this divine existence called kavod. And therefore, we're going to have a whole new perspective on Chovel b'Chavero, because now Chovel b'Chavero, which means that he not only injures his friend, but he humiliates him. One of the 5 categories he has to pay for in compensation is boshet, is by humiliating him. All that has to do with kavod, which has to do with the nefesh. And kavod, as we said, is Eloki. It is a divine dimension, a divine attribute called kavod. God is called Melech HaKavod. The root, the shoresh, the origin of all our neshamos is called kavod, that dimension of divinity. And when a person dies, after what's called siluk, histalkus means when the nefesh leaves the body, the nefesh goes back up to its origin, which is called kavod. And this is the pasuk in Yeshayahu Navi, quoted here in the 2nd paragraph, Kvod Hashem yaspecha. The kavod of Hashem will now, so to speak, gather in your nefesh. So the process of death, or histalkus, is God gathering in your nefesh into kavod. And now the nefesh goes back to its source, its origin in kavod. When a person reaches a new state of kavod, then it's almost as if he's beginning his life again. His nefesh is beginning a hischadshus meaning a new experience. Rabbi Nosson writes that if a person, heaven forbid, is pogam, he blemishes and destroys kavod, then what happens to that kavod? Kavod, as we said before, is an entity. It's something that exists. It's an abstract but yet real, spiritual, divine entity. What happens to that entity when a person is pogam and he blemishes the kavod, he downgrades the kavod? The kavod gets picked up. It's not lost. It's still there in the universe. And where does it go? It gets taken by the azei panim. Okay, that's another terminology that we're introducing for the first time, called azus panim. Azus panim are those bold and brazen people who try to undermine the kavod of the Jew. These are the enemies, the adversaries of the Jew, and their goal is to grab on and take possession, acquiring the cover that was lost from the Jew. So when we leave and lose kavod, the kavod is taken up and gathered together and acquired by our enemies. That's a very dangerous situation. We're going to see later that that's what Golus is all about. That's what exile is all about. And now, when the Azei Panim have taken away the kavod, the job or the goal is now to get back to repossess that kavod, to take it back from those who took it from us. So the kavod goes back, reverting to its original owner, which is Klal Yisrael. And Rabbi Nosson seems to assume that the Azei Panim could be non-Jews, Akum, who are the adversaries, or they could be Rishayim. They could be Jewish evildoers. And they will also be picking up this cover that we lost, and we have to get that covered back. Now, based on the Torah of Rabbi Nachman, the pasuk in Mishlei, which reads, Staka tatzil mimavis. Shlomo Melech says that staka, giving charity, will save a person from death, takes on a brand new meaning. And staka now, more than almost any other mitzvah that we have, plays a tremendous role in uplifting kavod and reacquiring the kavod that was taken away from us and that was lost. Now, there's a word tzedek, and then there's a word staka, the difference being the extra hay. That extra hay transforms tzedek into 5 dimensions of staka. There are 5 different dimensions, and that's part of Likutei Maran. In the next paragraph, which starts with the words Vazai Sheba Kavod Chadash Al Adam Melubash Betocho Nefesh de Kedusha, we have more of an insight into the Kabbalah of the Ari, in which he talks about 2 dimensions that are related to each other, that are close to each other. One is called Holada, and the other is called Gidul. And these 2 dimensions parallel Ava and Yira. And they are called Shtei Yodayim, the 2 arms. One arm is called the Yad HaGedola, and the other is called the Yad HaChazaka. And the Yad HaChazaka, which is Yira, that is called the Holada. And then we move on to something which is called Hagdola or Gidul. So there's like stage number 1, which is giving birth and giving life. And then stage number 2 is to raise that child, so to speak. And that's called Ava. And that's called Yad HaGedola. So Yad HaChazaka is the first stage of Holada. And then we get to the second stage, which is called Gidul. And that's Yad HaGedola. And that's Ava. And now we read paragraph Beis. Zeu bechinas iser hagadol shel haka v'chavola. Why is the Torah so concerned and so harsh about wounding another person or hitting another person? Ha-chovel b'chaveru pogem b'kvod chavero. He is now undermining the kavod of his friend when he hits him. And that kavod, as we said, is the divine origin and root of his nefesh. So what basically the chovel is doing by hitting his friend, he's now really touching on and removing the nefesh. He's really touching the nefesh. We think it's only, some physical action that he's doing. No. It's much deeper, because he is really now undermining the kavod, which is the nefesh of the nechbal, the one who is victimized. He says the Rasha, Chazal tell us, whose chovel b'chavero is ki'ilu notel nafsho. A very strange statement in Chazal. Why is he called notel nafsho? And now we can understand notel nafsho on two different levels. On the physical level of material reality and on a deeper level of spiritual reality. On the physical level, the Gemara tells us, chovel mitzumai chayav, if you injure a person to the point in which he bleeds, why you chayav for that on Shabbos? What malach does it come under? And according to one opinion, it comes under netilas neshama. Every aver, every part of the human body has a neshama. And when you take and destroy one aver of a person, you are in effect taking away his neshama. That's on a physical level. So a chovel v'amakes chaver notel nefesh chavero. Mamish. Mamish means in the physical reality of it. But the ikar pagam, what's more profound, is mashe pogem bekvod chavero. He is undermining this kavod, which, as we said before, is the divine spiritual origin of the nefesh. And how much more so mevaisho, if he humiliates his friend by hitting him, then it comes under the Gemara, but Metzia says, Hamal bin pnei chavero, if you humiliate your friend, you embarrass him. If it's public, ein lo chelik l'olam haba. And now we're talking about boshes. We're talking about humiliating someone, even b'dibur, even if you say certain words publicly that humiliate the person, even though you didn't strike him, and you didn't smite him, and you didn't cause any blood to come out. Chazal say that the blood turns colors, it becomes like white. He becomes white from embarrassment. Nimtza shepogem b'kvod Yisrael chavero v'notel nafsho al yedei hakov hachavola. That's why it's so severe. Now we fast forward to paragraph number 3. What are these 5 categories that the chovel is obligated to pay compensation? Nezek, sar, ripui, sheves, and boshes. So once again, Rabbi Nassan summarizes the point that now he's pogame in the covet of his friend. And now, as a result of that covet that's lost, the azepanim of the generation will take on and take over the kavod. That's the akum and the rishoyim hamoshlim al am dal bechina. And he says the following: Yesh Rames, this is paragraph number 4. These 5 categories of payment, shenosein hachovel hem keneged chamesh bechinos hanemorim b'Torah. So the 5 payments parallel 5 dimensions that are mentioned by the Torah. And what are these 5 dimensions? One is the nefesh itself. And the payment of these 5 categories, again, each one will parallel and correspond to another dimension, but the ultimate goal of paying these 5 categories is to replace the kavod. That's called a tikkun hanefesh. The kavod is the nefesh. He says that nezek, which is the first of the 5 categories, is hachzaras hanefesh. That's returning the nefesh. And I'll prove it to you, he says, from a pasuk in Chumash, v'nasata nefesh tachas nefesh, ayin tachas ayin, v'darshu rabosenu gemar baba kama mamon. He pays mamon. Mamon ha-nezek shemashalem hu b'shvil pagam hotzas ha-nefesh. As we said before, when a person is chovel b'chavero, he has taken the nefesh. Now he's going to replace that nefesh with mammon. Of course, in a perfect ideal world, if strict justice would be meted out, then we would take his eye, the eye of the Chovel, because it's got to be equal. But the Torah says mama. The Torah says, Torah Shebal Peh, that you pay mama. Then we get to tsar. Tsar, hu bechinas staka, ki tashlumei tsar bechinas staka, k'mo she'amru Rabbeinu b'Chovel shechayev al tsar afilu b'mokom nezek. Tsar is an additional payment above and beyond nezek. Nezek means we evaluate how much he would be worth in the market as a worker, as an employer, and how much he went down and declined as a result of the chaval. That's called nezek. And then we have tsar. Tsar means how much would a person pay in order to avoid the pain that he suffered. Now, what is the relationship between tsar, the payment of tsar, and tzedakah? So Rabbi Nosson develops a whole sophisticated, complex system where HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives tzedakah and he's merachim al abrios. And tsar is really a kind of element of rachmanis. Okay, we're gonna leave that out for the time being because our time is limited. Then he says ripui v'sheves. Those two correspond to the two elements that we mentioned earlier, yad chazaka and yad hagdola. To be molid the nefesh and to be megadol the nefesh. Ripui is called holodas hanefesh. Ki hamake v'hachavola, hamaka v'hachavola b'chinas yitzias hanefesh. Ki b'makom maka hamaka shamu b'chinas yitzias hanefesh b'yoso makom chavola. In the place that he injured him, it's considered like his nefesh was removed. Ukshechozer umerape es hamaka, but by administering cures of medicine, kedei shetichya, so that the organ that was damaged will now revive itself. Zebechinas holadas hanefesh. That's as if you, so to speak, created the nefesh because it was destroyed and now it's recreated. And rotzim lachzar laholid nefesh v'chiyus chadash b'makom zeh sheyotza cheluk me'hanefesh. And he proves that refuah in the Tanakh is called chiyus, it's giving life. Like it says in Yeshayahu Hanavi, v'tachlimeni usechayeni. So that's called refuah, ripui, and that corresponds to the yad chazak of holada. And now we have sheves. Sheves means you pay severance pay for work that was lost and income that he lost. That's already the next stage after holadas hanefesh. Ki hasheves hu shetzarich lifra lo masha mispatel mimalachto kol yemei cholyo ad shemisrapi legamrei. V'zeh bechinas gidol hanefesh. Why is that gidol hanefesh? Nefesh v'achiyus shenimshach la'chola nechbal al yidei refuah bechinas holada v'tzarich lismamea ad shetiskadel v'oz yachzor le'sano. So legadel means that there's going to be a process until he gets back to himself. I'm talking about the victim, obviously. And during that process, until he gets back to himself in full health, he loses work days. That's called sheves. You pay for that process of gidul hanefesh. And then we get to boshes. We said that humiliating a person is the most profound way of being pogam is kavod, because boshes is the opposite of kavod. Al kein tzarich l'shalom lo boshes al shepagam b'chvodo ubicho. He humiliated him and he removed his kavod. And that's the ikar pagam hagadol b'yosef. Ubazeh boshes shemeshalom lo mefaiso mesaken b'chinas Hatikun Anal, and so forth and so on. Okay. Izeh klal shekol echad miYisrael afilu apochol shebechusim sharsho b'makom elyon ma'od. Even the lowest person in Klal Yisrael has a root, an origin in his nefesh that's very, very hard. V'nishrash b'toch b'chinas zokin d'kedusha. He has a very high element. And now, given all this of an introduction, some of which we covered, some of which we didn't, we're now ready for, hey, the fifth paragraph, and we're going to zoom in to Golus Mitzrayim, which is the parsha that we're about to read in Mitzvah the Shabbos. Masha b'tchilas Golus Mitzrayim. When does the process of redemption begin? When Moshe Rabbeinu leaves the palace of Pharaoh. And what does Moshe Rabbeinu see? What does he become aware of? The tzara of Klal Yisrael. Kishehiskil Moshe lasum lev, when Moshe begins to become aware of the tzaras Yisrael, ha'maisa rishonim asherah, what's the first thing that he sees that makes him aware of the tzara of Klal Yisrael? Sherah hakos v'chavolos, shemakim es Yisrael. K'mo shekosav atzeit vayetze el echav vayar ish mitzri, make ish ivri me'echav. He sees, he witnesses a gigantic Mitzri, probably was wearing all the armor of of an Egyptian officer, who's hitting a Jew. And this is the first encounter and experience of Moshe with the Golus of Mitzrayim. Ikar Golus Mitzrayim, he says that Golus Mitzrayim is the paradigm of all the Goliaths. And what is Golus? Mashen Nafal HaKavod, that the kavod of Klal Yisrael was taken away. And it was now grabbed onto by the Azei Ponim, Shebidar. For example, the Akum, the Goyim. Ha'azei Ponim notably Atzmon Kol HaKavod. They take for themselves all the cover that was removed from Klal Yisrael. And therefore, Yisrael Heim Shfolim V'nivzim. Now Klal Yisrael become subjugated, low, and humiliated. That's what Golus is all about. V'lo dai she'ein Yisrael kavod. It would be bad enough if Yisrael lost their kavod. And be'emes, in the spiritual world, kavod belonged to the Jewish people. V'akol nivra b'shvilam, all the nefashos, and all the creation was for the sake of Klal Yisrael. So they certainly, the kavod belongs to them. But now, as a result of the undermining, the blemishing, and the damaging to the kavod of Yisrael, now miskabrim ha'azei ponim, the azei ponim, these adversaries, now grab onto the kavod. Notun the atzman kol kavod shel Yisrael. They steal, so to speak. They abscond with all the kavod that belongs to Yisrael. And what are they doing with this kavod? Rotim lichbosh nafshos Yisrael. They want to subjugate and lower the nafshos of Yisrael b'golus. Ki kshenotlim liatzman hakavod b'meilim imchakim gam kol nefashos etzlam. When they take the kavod, they now are grabbing onto all the nefashos, because we saw an equation between the kavod and the nefesh. Yeah, nefashos nimshachim achar kavod shehu sharsha. The root and the origin of the nefesh is kavod. This is the understanding of Golus Mitzrayim v'chol Golios, all the exiles. Ki v'Golus kol hakavod v'malchus eitzel ha'akum, all the kavod of the Jewish people and the subjugation, the sovereignty, the the domination of Klal Yisrael is in the hands of the Akum. They now take on to the very neshamos, the nefashos of Klal Yisrael. Al Yidei Godol Azusam, with their great Azus Ponim. Shal Yidei Zeh Loklu Lehem Kol HaKoved VaMalchus. V'al Kein, Hoyatova Gedol Yisrael, Masha Yosef Yored B'Tchila Mitzrayim. When you open up Sefer Shmos, and in Perek Aleph, you fast forward to Pasuk Hey, you'll see that it says V'Yosef Hoya B'Mitzrayim. Why is that relevant? I mean, we're talking about the subjugation of the Jewish people at the hands of the Mitzrim. That's the subject of Parsha Shmos. Why emphasize that Yosef went down to Mitzrayim? And the answer is that if not for the fact that Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim, we, the Jewish people, don't even have a chance to ever survive the Golus of Mitzrayim. Why? Because when Yosef goes down to Mitzrayim, Sham Zachal Kavod Gadol, Vanasa Sham Melech. Kavod now belongs to Yosef. Yosef equals Kavod. Again, Kavod in the spiritual world of Elokus, of divinity. And now Yosef uses that Kavod and he draws forth all of Bnei Yisrael to his Kavod. And that's what the pasuk means, that after Yosef reveals himself to his brothers, he commands them to go back to father Jacob, V'gadatem li avi, and tell my father, Eskol kvodi b'Mitzrayim, that I now have the possession of kavod in Mitzrayim, and therefore you can join me, and you don't have to be afraid that the enemies, the Azei Panim, have taken away the kavod, because kol kvodi b'Mitzrayim. Again, it's shedding a whole new light on this pasuk. We don't understand this pasuk without Rabbi Nosson, because we think that Yosef is talking about, glory and kavod. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about that divine entity or dimension which defines the nefesh. That's what we have in Mitzrayim. That's what Yosef has. And therefore, mihartem v'oradatem es avihena, bring my father down. Ki Yosef zocha b'Mitzrayim l'kavod the kedusha. The holy kavod is what Yosef had acquired. And therefore, what he was able to do was to elevate all the kavod from Zuamas Mitzrayim, Lachzor la Kedusha. Now this line over here about Lahalos es Zuamas Mitzrayim, this has to do with the Kabbalah of the Ari, which again, it's not for us, but I'll just mention it in passing. According to the Ari, after the Chet of Adam Arishon, a period of time in Adam's life, which is about 130 years, he is creating, or I shouldn't say creating, but what is created is all sorts of sparks of holiness that go into first the Dar Hamabel, and then the Dar Plaga, and then finally down, ultimately down to Mitzrayim. So there are a lot of these sparks, these nitzotos that are trapped in Mitzrayim. And Yosef begins the process of elevating and freeing those nitzotos from Mitzrayim. While Yidei Zeh, as a result of Yosef acquiring the kavod of Kedusha, Himshich l'shames kol nefashos beis Yisrael. We now begin to understand why Sefer Shmos opens up with the words "V'Yosef hayu b'Mitzrayim," because he's going to be mamshich. He's going to bring all of the nefashos of Beis Yaakov, the whole household of Jacob, down to Mitzrayim. Ki nefashos nimshachas achar kavod shu sharsham, because again the nefesh is pulled to kavod because kavod is the origin, the source of the nefesh. And that's what it means. V'yigadati li'avias kol kvodim. V'hoyeh tova gedol l'nafshos Yisrael. Let's begin to appreciate the great gift that God gave the Jewish people, that Yosef went down to Mitzrayim and acquired kavod. Ki im lav, meaning if it wouldn't have been so, had Yosef not come down to Mitzrayim, hoyu chas v'sholom Yisrael muchrachim leiled Mitzrayim al yidei kavod hamalchus shel Mitzrayim bi'atzmon. If Yosef did not acquire kavod, if Yosef was not in the picture in Mitzrayim, then all the kavod would be in the hands of the Mitzrayim. Because that source of the nefesh of Yisrael is covered, and now it's in the hands of the Mitzrayim. The Mitzrayim would have drawn all the nefashos of Yisrael back to their origin, to the kavod, and now the kavod is in the hands of the Mitzrayim. And therefore, if not for the great chesed of Hashem, the Tova Gedola, then Roy Hoya Yaakov Avinu Leired LeMitzrayim Shal Shalosh Shal Barza. Yaakov would have been brought down as a prisoner in the iron, the iron, what do they call it? When you chain someone down. Why? Because all the kavod belongs to the Mitzrayim, the Azei Panim, and the kavod's taken away from Yisrael. That's what Golus is all about. But Al Yedei Zeh, because Yosef came down first, and he acquired the kavod, therefore, Hayalehem Koach, the Jewish people coming down to time had the power, the kiyum, and the sustenance, Leos b'Mitzrayim v'lotzes misham, so they could eventually get out of Mitzrayim. V'akol b'kochu shel Yosef HaTzadik. It's all a result of Yosef. Even though after Yosef and his brothers died, Gavru HaMitzrim, the Mitzrim took over the power, and they stole the kavod. V'imshichu liatzmon es kol hakavod ad shekavshu nefesh Yisrael b'golus. Afal pichein, nevertheless, hoya lahem kvar hoya lahem koach liskayim. The Jews already acquired the potential, the power to survive the Marirus and the Golus, the exile, and all the bitter experiences of slavery. We go back to the original Bia, when they came to Mitzrayim, they covered the Kedusha. That was the cover of Yosef, which was the cover of the Kedusha. And that fortified Klal Yisrael with the potential koach to overcome the great challenges of Marirus, of Golus, so that they can sometime be redeemed and they can go out of Mitzrayim. Valkein Moshe Rabbeinu shehistil asum liba al tzara shel Yisrael shein kvusha b'golus zeh, etc., etc. And when Moshe Rabbeinu becomes aware of the fact that the Azei Panim have taken over the kavod, and the golus is so bitter and so intense and profound. They took all the kavod of Mitzrayim. They lower and subjugate and humiliate the people of Israel. Al-Kain therefore makes sense that the Ma'aser Rishona, the first experience that Moshe had, the first contact, the first spectacle that he saw in front of his eyes of the lack of kavod of Klal Yisrael, is Vayar Ish Mitzri Maka Ish Ivri. And this big, burly Egyptian soldier or officer is hitting a Jew. That's what Golus is. The undermining of the status of kavod, of the nefesh of Yisrael. And after Moshe sees this, he finally has an answer to his question. He has a deep question that bothers his mind. Why are Klal Yisrael worthy of all this suffering? But what happens the very next day? two Jews are fighting with each other. They're arguing each other. Vayomer l'Rasha lama sakareyecha. Why are you hitting your friend? Achen vayomer Moshe declares no dad over. What's no dad over? Rashi explains. Now I have an answer to the question: why are Klal Yisrael so deserving of being schlepped into the Mitzrayim, which represent the 70 nations of the world, are adversaries? And they will be subjugated to work and slave. Now I see this is what they deserve. This is divine justice. And why? Just because he sees a machlokes between two Jews, some sort of altercation, and one hits the other. And therefore, he now understands why Jewish people have to be subject to golus, to exile. What's it all about? But the answer is that this one witness, this one spectacle that he saw in front of his eyes, convinced Moshe Rabbeinu that the Jewish people, are malei machlokes. This was not one single incident, some sort of aberration, but rather this is machlokes and chavolos ushar maisen. Roim harbe miod. And now we begin to see why the covet of Klal Yisrael was taken away. It's neither keneged neither, because they were undermining the covet of their fellow Jews, and therefore their kavod was taken away from them. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu declares a pasuk in Yeshaya, L'chvodi barasid, Yisrael nekroim kavod. We are covered, and God created the world for that covered. L'kavod barasiv, the pasuk says. If there was no machlokes amongst the Jews, then the goyim could have no koach. They would have no power to take the kavod away for themselves, because God created the world for the kavod of Israel. The only reason that the mitzvah were able to grab onto the kavod, which really belongs as the sole possession of Klal Yisrael, is because nifkam hakavod al yidei Yisrael atzma. And Rabbi Nosson in the next paragraph says that that's why we're not seeing the geula, the redemption, in our time, and we're seeing golus, in which the goyim, my father used to talk about his youth, what he saw when he was a youngster in Lithuania, and the subjugation of the Jew. The Jew was low, was considered Chovel. And this is because the Akum were Kovesh, they took over all the kavod from Yisrael. Not only that, kavod reaches its most intense manifestation in the Beis HaMikdash, and ultimately the golus is going to lead to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara tells us in Yuma, why was the second Beis HaMikdash destroyed? Al sinas china, for base hatred, as we translate. And he says that now we're getting close to the Geula, to the Mashiach. And what's holding the Mashiach back? It's the machlokes. The machlokes within the Jewish community. Ki ikar arichos hagolus. The reason why golus is schlepping along almost endlessly, the longer bitter golus, is al yedei machlokes sheben Yisrael atzma. Ki machmas hamachlokes Yisrael pogmim b'kavod Yisrael b'yedei ze nifkam hakavod. And then, as we said before, the azei panim will now take over the kavod. And these are the enemies of the Jewish people that will subjugate us and humiliate us. And ki ikar shlemus hakavod, the kedusha shel Yisrael, who should call echad b'Yisrael. Listen to the language, Rabbi Nosson, amazing language. Kol echad b'Yisrael yevatel atzmo mi'od neged chavera. The yevatel kvodom v'nei kvod chavera. He should give up on his own kavod for the sake of the kavod of his chaver. This sounds like, again, it's almost a century before the Alter of Slobodka, who used to say this. V'zeu ikar shlemus v'tikun hakavod. Ezu mechubad, the Mishnah Novos, hamachabed es habrios. If you respect the kavod of your friend, then you're called mechubad. Ki kvod Yisrael ukvod hamakom baruch hu. And in essence, kavod of Yisrael is identical with kavod hamakom. V'zeu sha'amar Moshe k'shara shnei anoshim ivrim nitzim umakim echad es chavero. Now Moshe Rabbeinu witnesses that one Jew is hitting another Jew. V'gam yesh bazeh dilturin. And not only that, they wanted to snitch on Moshe that he had killed the Mitzri because they saw Moshe kill the Mitzri. Masira, that's the worst Avera is possible, when you give over a Jew to the authorities. Are you coming to kill me? They asked Moshe Rabbeinu like you killed the Mitzri. And now he has an answer to his question, as we said earlier. Roe Ani, says Moshe Rabbeinu, declares, "Hey, Me'uyim Lakach, Me'achar sheyesh le'machlokas v'dilatorin, pogvim echad b'kvod chavero." They undermine the covenant of the chaver, ubefrad, and what's worse is that pogvim b'kvod atzadik ha'emes shu Moshe, u'me'achar she'en bi'atzman pogvim b'kavod al yidei zeh nifkam ha'kavod b'yoseh. If the pagima against the covenant is within the Jewish people, one Jew to another, that's the worst pagam that you could have in the kavod. Until Paro takes over the kavod, he's kovesh is Yisrael b'golos. He subjugates the Jewish people. His ikar golos mitzrayim in number vav al yidei pagama kavod she nafal yazei ponim. And he says that it all really starts with Adam HaRishon, because with the chait of Adam HaRishon, he was pogem in the covenant of the Makom, in the covenant of Hashem. He rebelled against God. This is the root of all evil, of all machlokes, of all adversity in the attempts of the Goyim to subjugate the Jewish nation and humiliate them. And therefore, what happens almost immediately after the Chet of Adam HaRishon, Vayakov Kayin El Hevel Achim. Once you've taken away the kavod, and Adam HaRishon did that, now the stage is set to go beyond that and take away another kavod, and that's Hevel, who is now victimized and murdered by his brother Cain. This is the first murder as a result of machlokes and akar ba'olam. It's really just a continuation of the sin of Adam HaRishon, which ends up in machlokes. And the machlokes is all about the fact that Cain wanted to take the kavod for himself. So that Cain is a manifestation of azus. Now, at this point, Rabbi Nassan has a whole discussion about what's called tat or tach. And these are the pogroms that took place in the middle of the 17th century, the 1600s. We don't know how many Jews were killed. I saw one estimate as 500,000 Jews were murdered during these gzeros of Tach v'Tach. And back in the day, they used to have a special fast day to commemorate the gzeros of Tach v'Tach. That was the 20th of Sivan. It got lost in oblivion. But for many centuries, that was a fast day on the official calendar. U'misanim, we fast al harigas hakdoshim, kamalofim v'rivos nafshos b'Yisrael hakdoshim. tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews that were killed al Kiddush Hashem, shenergu b'shnas tach, Tov Ches. It's about almost 5 centuries ago. And it's very interesting because the Zohar seems to indicate that the year of Tach was designated for Mashiach. And he brings a remiss from the pasuk Bezos Yovo Aaron. If you take the word Zos, Zion Aleph, which is 8, and Tov, you get Tov Chav, Tov Ches. And Bezos Yovo Aaron El HaKodesh. B'lechora Dover Tamua. Rabbi Nosson doesn't understand. This was meant to be the time of Mashiach, and it went from one extreme to the other. Instead of Mashiach, what we end up with is the greatest destruction of Jewish communities, the murder of untold numbers. Lo dai shelo zachinu sheyavo Mashiach. Bad enough that we weren't zocher to Mashiach. But worse is this hapech hadavar v'nergu alafim v'rivos nefashos b'Yisrael. And he says the following, that the Iker Kavod, as we said before, is the Kavod of Yisrael. And Mashiach is going to come when that Kavod for Yisrael is on the highest level. As the Pasuk says, V'nigla Kvod Hashem, Ukvodo Olayach Yeroeh, V'chayotzi bo other psukim, Haflogas HaKavod Shel Yisrael. The most profound kavod that's being given to Klal Yisrael and recognized. And at that point, Mashiach is going to come. V'oz tia p'gido l'tova b'yemes b'shlemus she'agia zman agula mitis b'mheira v'yamenu, he prays. And that's going to be kibui skolios, gathering in the exiles, how they go to like kavod Yova Yisrael. Again, if the Israelis will let you go through and land in Ben Gurion Airport, but in any event, Yiskabzu kol neshamos Yisrael el hakavod hagadol hazeh. That's what Mashiach is about. The kavod, which is the shoresh, the root of nefashos, and all the neshamos and all the nefashos will gravitate towards Mashiach. And the pasuk says in Yeshayahu, Hevi banai meirachok ubnosai miktzei haaretz kol hanikra b'shmi lichvodi barasim ki kibutz nefashos Yisrael b'chinas havi banai ubnosai v'yia al yedei godel hakavod sheyeh Yisrael oz. This is how great the cover will be. Al yedei zeh yu nikroim v'nimshachim kulam el hakavod. Everybody will be gathered in together and gravitationally pulled towards the kavod. The yachsim v'yiskatsu l'toch Eretz Yisrael v'Yishalayim shesham ikar kvod Hashem. V'zeu b'chinas kol hanikra b'shmi l'chvodi. But what happens? Al kein oz b'shnas tach shahoisa oz eis p'kida al bias hamashiach shayamuchan hakavod level Yisrael. Everything, the stage was set for the kavod to be returned and restored to Klal Yisrael. Aval adayin lo hayu Yisrael re'uyim oz legeula. Unfortunately, they were not ready for geula. They didn't deserve geula. Ki hakavod lokach liyosaf liatzmo kama v'kama nefashos Yisrael shenergu oz al kiddush Hashem shezeh bechinas kvod Hashem yasvecha. You may remember that we started today at the beginning of Gimel with that pasuk of kvod Hashem yasvecha, a pasuk in Yeshaya Nun Ches. And now kvod Hashem yasvecha takes on a whole new meaning. Ki anafashos nerogim al kiddush Hashem. This is another way of kvod Hashem. The perfect, ideal way of kvod Hashem is when the covenant of Yisrael is elevated and all of Klal Yisrael are nimshach, and they're drawn into this Chovel. But now we have a different Kavod Hashem Yasveka, in which God is gathering together the Neshamos, the Nefashos, and they're rogim al Kiddush Hashem against the ultimate goal is Kiddush Hashem. But if we're not worthy of the Kiddush Hashem, of the Geula, of Mashiach, through the elevation of Kavod, then there's a different way that God brings about Kiddush Hashem, and that's through, tragically, the Neshamos, the Nefashos, and Erogim al Kiddush Hashem. Ki al Yidei shen Erogim al Kvod Shmo shel Kiddush Hashem, al Yidei zen is Gadol v'nis Kaddish v'nis Kabed Kvod Shmo. Again, it's something that's very hard for us to comprehend. Val Yidei, Val Kein v'chol Eish Rotz Hashem lahagdil Kavod. What is the Eis HaGeula, the Eis HaMashiach, is the time for Agdolas Kavod, to increase and intensify the Kavod. If they weren't worthy of Mashiach, then there'll be a different method of Hagdolas Kavod Hashem. It's B'chol Eish Rotz Hashem Yisbarach lahagdil HaKavod D'Kedusha. But they weren't ready for the Gula. At that time, there had to be Agdolas HaKavod, and there's no other option but Shiamusu Nafshos Yisrael HaKadosh Hashem. And that's what the pasuk means when it says in Shmos Chavtes, B'nigdash B'chvodi. At the moment of the dedication of the Mishkan, the Iker Kavod of the Mishkan was the Kedusha of Kavod Hashem, when the Shekhinah would come down and rest in the Mishkan, as the pasuk says in Shmos Mem, Ukvod Hashem Mole Es HaMishkan, or a pasuk in Divrei Hayom, Ukvod Hashem Mole Sabayis, is at the moment of Hakamas HaMishkan, when the Kavod comes Lamata, when Hashem's Kavod comes to be Mashra Shekhinah be Yisrael, is machma sha'oz hadayin lo nistaken gam kavod v'shleimus. All that we had done to be pogim kavod was not, there was no perfect tikkun. Hadayin lo nistaken oz legamre, and especially the Chet HaEgel, which is the most profound pegima in kavod, in the kavod of Hashem, the also avodah zarah, the Amru Elu Ehech Yisrael. But zeh pogmu miyod b'kvodo, Ki nasnu kavod la'avodah zarah, and al kein machma sha'az hadayin lo nistaken pagam kavod b'shleimus al yidei zeh nimshach b'zman sheba hakavod liYisrael beis hakamas hamishkan kvod Hashem yasfecha is shtei nefashos kedoshos shehein nadav haviu mesu. They died because this is v'nigdash b'chvodi. This is the way God institutes and implements a kedusha of kavod. And dafka on that day, which was meant to be the day of celebration, and the day of the Shekhinah coming down, on that day, God takes the lives of Nadav Aviv. Ki zeh klal yotzei mitchilas haTorah she'ein zochen lahamshich v'lekabel hakavod b'shleimus. If we don't merit getting that kavod in its full form, then the kavod will have to be achieved in a different form. And that's why these tragedies took place. Now, we're running out of time, so that I was thinking of learning with you paragraph number Yud, which talks about Histalkus HaTzadik, and talks about Holchem al Kivrei Tzadikim. It talks about concepts like Eretz Yisrael and Pagama Bris, and Pagama Bris equals Pagama Kavod. And what does it mean, Histalkus HaTzadik, where he's zochet to a kedusha, gedola of kavod Hashem? And these are very deep concepts. And he ties it all together with Kalev. If you remember that Kalev, when he got sent on the mission, together with Yoshua, Yoshua had the the backing of the prayers of Moshe Rabbeinu, but Kalev didn't receive that strength of the covenant of the bracha and the tefillah of Moshe Rabbeinu. So where did he go? The Chazal say, Vayovad Chevron, Rashi quotes the Chazal, that Halach lishtateach al kivrei avos. He went to Chevron to prostrate himself on the kever of the avos. And that prostration is going to bring him connected to the kavod of the tzaddik after the stalkus. And once he gets that infusion, so to speak, of kavod, it's like the kavod of Hashem coming down from the higher realms down into the Mishkan. And as a result, Kalev is able to save himself from atas meraglim, from the terrible etza of the other meraglim, which basically fits into the pattern that we've been discussing tonight, that the kavod is taken over by the azei panim shebidar, and the azei panim shebidar are the other meraglim. And how does Kalev achieve protection from the azei panim? He holds on to kavod. How does he get that holy kavod? By being shtatech b'kivrei avos, and going back to the Sheni Chevron and connecting with the tzaddik after his histalkus. Again, this is a long discussion, not for now. And if we had more time, we would talk about the insights of Rabbi Nosson into the 2 7-year periods. 1 7-year period, which is the Sova, right? That was the 7-year period of plenty, and then the 7-year period of Ra'av that followed with the famine of those years. So this is where we're going to stop for tonight. And I'll take this opportunity to thank you for coming and joining me and wishing you a great Shabbos Parshas Shmos. And Yiratzah that we should be zocher to reclaim the covenant of Klal Yisrael, so the covenant of Kedusha, that will give us a connection back to the Shoresh of Neshamas. And we will restore those stolen elements of cover that were taken by our enemies. And that will bring about, in Mirza Hashem, the Geula Shlema when Mashiach will come in Herav Yemenu.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom.